Ever wondered how our ancestors kept food from spoiling without electricity? Could you survive without your refrigerator? The medieval period might seem like the dark ages of food safety, but people were surprisingly resourceful when it came to preserving their hard-earned harvests and fresh catches. Number 8. The salt of the earth. Have you ever thought about how essential salt was in medieval times? Salt wasn't just a flavor enhancer, it was literally worth its weight in gold. Medieval preservation relied heavily on this mineral miracle, which drew moisture out of foods through osmosis, creating environments where bacteria couldn't thrive. Across medieval Europe, salt production was a massive industry, with entire towns growing wealthy from salt mining or sea salt harvesting. In coastal regions, massive shallow pans were filled with seawater, which was left to evaporate under the sun. Inland, salt mines became so valuable that workers were sometimes paid in salt. This is actually where we get the word salary from, derived from the Latin word for salt, sal. The preservation process was straightforward but effective. Meats would be thoroughly rubbed with salt, packed in barrels, and left as the salt drew out moisture. Fish, particularly cod and herring, underwent similar treatment, creating storable protein sources that lasted months or even years. Salt-preserved fish became so important to medieval European diet that it influenced trade routes and even religious practices, with salted fish becoming a staple during Lent when fresh meat was forbidden. Noble households and monasteries maintained special salting rooms where precision salting happened under careful supervision. The quality of salting could mean the difference between having food through winter or facing starvation. For common folk, salt was precious and used more sparingly, often mixed with other preservation methods for efficiency. Number 7. Sweet preservation. Did you know honey was medieval Europe's antibacterial superfood? Before refined sugar became widely available, honey was the primary sweetener throughout medieval Europe, but its preservative properties made it even more valuable. Honey contains hydrogen peroxide and has such high sugar content that it creates an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. Medieval cooks discovered that fruits preserved in honey stayed edible for remarkably long periods. They would carefully select ripe fruits, immerse them fully in honey, and seal them in earthenware pots. When opened months later, these preserves provided a sweet reminder of summer's bounty during the barren winter months. Beyond fruits, some cultures even preserved meats in honey, creating what would have been a sweet-savory combination that helped extend their protein sources through leaner times. The antiseptic properties of honey were so well understood that it was also used medicinally to prevent wound infections. Honey gathering was a specialized craft, with some communities maintaining designated bee gardens. Skilled beekeepers used smoke to calm the bees before harvesting, much like modern techniques. The most valued honey came from wild bees living in forests, believed to have special properties because of the diverse flora the bees visited. Monasteries often kept extensive beehives, using the honey not only for preservation but also for making mead, a fermented honey drink consumed widely across medieval Europe. The precious liquid was stored in special cool rooms, where its properties remained stable for extended periods. Number 6. Fermentation Station. Could bacteria actually help food last longer? Medieval people may not have understood the microbiology, but they certainly mastered the art of fermentation as preservation. Fermentation was everywhere in medieval kitchens and cellars. Cabbage transformed into sauerkraut, milk became cheese and yogurt, and grains turned into beer and alcohol. All these processes relied on beneficial organisms that convert sugars into acids or alcohols, creating environments where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. Beer brewing wasn't just for enjoyment, it was a practical way to preserve the calories from grains in a form that remained safe to consume for months. The alcohol content prevented spoilage, making beer safer to drink than water in many medieval towns. Almost every household brewed their own ale, with women often serving as the primary brewers before it became a commercial enterprise. Cheesemaking represented another ingenious preservation strategy. Fresh milk spoils quickly, but when transformed into cheese, it could last months or even years. Different regions developed unique cheese varieties based on local climate, available milk, and storage needs. Hard, aged cheeses like Parmesan were particularly valued for their long shelf life, becoming portable, concentrated nutrition sources. Vegetable fermentation created vitamin-rich food stores for winter months. Cabbages, turnips, and other garden produce were packed into barrels with salt brine, where lactic acid bacteria would transform them into tangy, preserved foods rich in vitamin C and other nutrients that helped ward off diseases like scurvy during winter months. Number 5. Smoke signals. How could simple smoke turn perishable meat into something that lasts for months? The medieval smokehouse was an essential part of food security, turning the preservative power of smoke into long-term food storage. Smoking combined multiple preservation techniques in one process. First, the meat or fish would typically be salted or brined. Then it would be hung in specially designed smokehouses where fires burning below produced smoke that rose up around the food. The smoke contained compounds that both flavored the food and acted as preservatives, while the heat from the process helped dry the food, further extending its shelf life. Different woods created distinct flavors. Oak, apple, and cherry were particularly prized for their aromatic qualities. The temperature control was crucial. Too hot and the meat would cook rather than smoke properly. Not enough heat and harmful bacteria might survive. Medieval smokehouses ranged from simple structures in peasant homes to elaborate buildings on manor estates. The smoking process might last anywhere from several days to weeks, depending on what was being preserved and how long it needed to last. Fish like salmon and herring were commonly smoked, as were various cuts of pork, creating bacon and ham that would provide protein through the winter. The knowledge of smoking techniques was passed down through generations, with each family guarding their particular methods. Regional variations developed across Europe, creating distinct food traditions that still influence cuisine today. German Black Forest ham, Scottish smoked salmon, and various smoked sausages all have their roots in medieval preservation necessities. Number 4. Drying times. What's the simplest way to keep food from rotting? Medieval people understood that removing moisture was key to preventing spoilage, making drying one of their most accessible preservation methods. Sun drying was the most straightforward approach, used extensively for fruits like apples, pears, plums, and berries. Sliced thinly and laid out on clean cloths or special racks, fruits would dry in the sun over several days, concentrating their sugars and eliminating the moisture bacteria need to grow. These dried fruits became portable energy sources that could be reconstituted in water or eaten as is. For regions with less reliable sunshine, herbs and some vegetables were hung in bunches from kitchen rafters, slowly drying in the warmth from cooking fires. Onions and garlic were often braided into strings and hung in cool, dry spots where they could remain usable for months. In coastal areas, fish drying became a major industry. Cod particularly was split, salted slightly, and then air-dried on wooden racks called flakes. The resulting product, stockfish, became so hard it had to be beaten with a hammer before cooking but would last almost indefinitely. This preserved cod became a trading commodity throughout medieval Europe, particularly important during religious periods when meat was forbidden. Meat drying often combined salt curing with air drying to create products like jerky. Thin strips of meat would be salted and then hung in areas with good airflow but protected from insects and rodents. The resulting preserved meat was lightweight and portable, making it valuable for travelers and soldiers. Number 3. Pickling perfection. Could vinegar be the unsung hero of medieval food preservation? Across medieval Europe, the sharp tang of vinegar kept countless foods edible far beyond their natural lifespan. Pickling involved submerging foods in vinegar, creating an acidic environment where most harmful microorganisms couldn't survive. While modern pickling often involves heat processing, medieval pickling relied on the acidity itself, along with spices that had their own antimicrobial properties. Vegetables were the most commonly pickled foods. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, and various root vegetables all found their way into pickling barrels. The process was straightforward. Clean the vegetables, pack them into stoneware crocks or wooden barrels, cover them with vinegar, often flavored with herbs and spices, and seal to prevent evaporation. The vinegar itself was typically made from fermented wine or ale that had turned sour. While this might seem like a loss for beverages, skilled vinegar makers were valued for their ability to produce high-quality preserving liquid. Some monasteries specialized in vinegar production, selling their product to surrounding communities. Pickling also extended to fruits, creating sweet-sour preserves, and occasionally to eggs and some meats. Pickled herrings became particularly important in Northern European diets, providing protein through lean times and becoming culturally significant foods that persist in Nordic cuisine today. Medieval cooks discovered that adding certain spices to their pickling mixtures, mustard seeds, peppercorns, cloves, not only enhanced flavors but also helped prevent spoilage. These spice-infused pickles were particularly valued for their ability to enliven the often monotonous winter diet, adding sharp, tangy flavors to meals dominated by bread and porridge. Number 2. Underground storage. Did medieval people have natural refrigeration right beneath their feet? Long before electric cooling, people recognized the stable, cool temperatures underground could significantly extend food storage life. Root cellars represented one of the most effective food preservation methods available to medieval households. Dug into hillsides or beneath homes, these underground rooms maintained temperatures around 50 to 55 deg F, 10 to 13 deg C, year-round, cool enough to slow spoilage dramatically without freezing. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, and beets stored particularly well in these conditions. Carefully placed in layers of clean sand or straw to prevent direct contact, these vegetables could remain fresh for months. Apples and pears were often wrapped individually in paper or cloth and placed on shelves in the coolest parts of the cellar. Cabbages might be pulled up with roots intact and hung upside down from the ceiling beams, while onions and garlic would be braided and hung from walls. The cool, relatively humid conditions prevented these vegetables from drying out too quickly while still inhibiting mold growth and bacterial activity. For wealthier households, more elaborate structures called ice houses were constructed. These specialized buildings, often partially underground, were designed to store ice harvested during winter. The ice blocks, insulated with straw, could last well into summer months, providing limited refrigeration for dairy products and meats in noble households. Communities in mountainous regions sometimes created communal food storage caves, taking advantage of naturally cool mountain environments. These shared spaces allowed for efficient food storage and created community responsibility for maintaining food security through winter months. Number 1. Confis and preserves. What do you call meat preserved in its own fat? Medieval cooks mastered this luxurious preservation technique centuries before modern canning methods existed. Confi, from the French word confire meaning to preserve, involved cooking meat slowly in its own fat, then storing it completely submerged in that same fat. The method was particularly associated with duck and goose, but was applied to other meats as well. The layer of fat created an airproof seal that prevented bacterial growth, while the initial cooking process eliminated existing microorganisms. This preservation technique created not just stored food but delicacies. The slow cooking produced incredibly tender meat infused with rich flavor. For wealthy medieval households, having confits stored away meant both food security and culinary luxury available on demand. The process began with salting the meat pieces for a day or two, drawing out moisture. The meat was then gently cooked in rendered fat until tender but not falling apart. Everything would be transferred to earthenware storage containers, with the meat completely submerged in fat and sealed with additional fat on top. When properly stored in cool conditions, these confits could last for months. A related preservation technique involved fruit preserves. Before sugar became widely available, honey was used to preserve fruits through similar principles, creating an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't reproduce. Fruits would be cooked with honey until thick, then sealed in containers where the high sugar concentration prevented spoilage. As sugar gradually became more available in late medieval Europe, though still expensive, fruit preserves became more common. The preserving power of sugar, like honey, came from creating an osmotic environment that dehydrated microorganisms. These sweet preserves served both practical preservation needs and became status symbols, with elaborate banqueting stuffs displayed at noble gatherings. Could you manage without modern refrigeration if you had to? The medieval world reminds us that human ingenuity found multiple solutions to food preservation long before electricity. From simple drying techniques accessible to peasant families to elaborate confis in noble households, these preservation methods didn't just prevent hunger, they created distinctive food traditions that continue to influence our culinary heritage today. Next time you enjoy pickles, jerky, smoked salmon, or preserved fruits, you're tasting history that saved lives through medieval winters. How many of these ancient techniques could still serve us in a modern power outage?